Historically, there hasn't been any real recourse for pharmacies when PBMs violated CMS rules, regulations, and frankly, the law. There isn't a clear-cut private right of action for pharmacies to challenge these unreasonable terms and conditions. There hasn't been any CMS enforcement mechanism, and there's no real framework for holding CMS accountable to actually enforce the laws that it's charged with enforcing. So one of the big goals of this legislation was to create a framework for pharmacies to be able to act to get CMS to intervene and actually hold PBMs and Part D plan sponsors accountable, particularly where they're putting forth unreasonable terms and conditions for participation. And what's really interesting too is even though it created a mechanism for pharmacies to complain to CMS and to challenge it, it also preserved the rights that pharmacies had under law and under contract to be able to try to challenge under their own. In addition, historically, there weren't any factors or guidance that weighed in on whether terms and conditions were reasonable and relevant. So at a federal level, you had a law, the Any Willing Provider Law, that said pharmacies had to be able to participate on terms and conditions applicable to other participating pharmacies. CMS had previously put out regulations that said those terms and conditions have to be reasonable and relevant, but there wasn't any definition or guidance around what constituted reasonable and relevant terms and conditions. And CMS had kind of neglected to do so out of fear that they would run afoul of this other provision, the non-interference clause, that sought to prohibit them from interfering in negotiations between manufacturers, PBMs, and pharmacies. So what this law does, what it seeks to do, is to put a finer point on what it means to be reasonable and relevant. It goes through a number of factors and essentially creates CMS as a standard setter for what constitutes reasonable and relevant terms and conditions, especially as it relates to things like reimbursement rates and other terms for participation. There's also a pervading lack of transparency around how PBMs set their terms, what they actually were, and who knew about them, whether it be the pharmacies, whether it be Part D plan sponsors, even whether it was CMS. And so there's been a lot more push for greater levels of transparency by PBMs in the Part D space. And then finally, I think one of the things that was aimed to be combated was this self-dealing behavior by vertically integrated PBMs, plans, and pharmacies, particularly where they were favoring affiliated pharmacies or they were actively steering patients to their affiliated pharmacies, notwithstanding some of the protections that have been on the books for some time for pharmacies. One of the hallmarks of the regulation that now is explicitly stated in the law is that terms and conditions have to be reasonable and relevant. Now, what constituted reasonable and relevant was a big question mark. There had been some guidance, unenforceable guidance put out by CMS in the past that talked about different things that might go to whether or not something was reasonable and relevant, but there wasn't a clear set of standards or guideposts that could be utilized. One of the things that this law does is explicitly says that CMS is to be responsible for setting standards as to what constitutes reasonable and relevant terms and conditions, and to actually adjudicate whether terms and conditions are reasonable and relevant. And they've given a number of factors that CMS is expected to utilize when evaluating whether terms and conditions on the whole are reasonable and relevant. One of the core factors is current prescription drug plan and pharmacy network contracting practices. So looking at what the industry is doing across the board, both under the Medicare Part D space and in the commercial space. This is an area that's kind of the first place to look. Another one, unsurprisingly, is whether the pharmacy's reimbursement rate for the drug costs along with dispensing fees sufficiently covers the ingredient cost for the drug, the pharmacy's cost for the products, as well as reasonable operational expenses for that pharmacy. Simply reimbursing a pharmacy below their acquisition cost, theoretically shouldn't fly any longer, nor should it be okay to pay a pharmacy exactly what it costs them to buy the drug. How could the pharmacy keep its lights on if it's not making any margin based on the cost of drugs when it's dispensing that product? They also look at things like the application of pharmacy quality measures. This was a big area of focus in the DIR fee space where PBMs were using quality measures to determine reimbursement. So looking at how and under what circumstances they are using those quality measures. Also looking at any limitations that are being placed on pharmacies being able to dispense drugs, whether it is on a drug by drug basis, whether it is on a pharmacy by pharmacy basis, whether it's on a subset of pharmacy type. So, for example, if they are trying to limit specialty drugs to specialty pharmacies or trying to exclude certain subclasses of providers, that's going to be something that's considered by CMS. They're also interestingly going to look at auditing practices and examining how those auditing practices tie into whether or not terms and conditions on the whole are reasonable and relevant. So if they give everyone great terms to come in, great reimbursement rate, great participation, but then they selectively audit only independent pharmacies and really make it unbearable to be a network, that could be an issue. And then other factors that CMS can determine along the way that that bear on the issue of whether or not terms are reasonable and relevant on the whole. What's interesting is there is now a framework for pharmacies to submit complaints and make reports, both pharmacies and other third parties to make reports that terms and conditions aren't reasonable and relevant, or that there's violations by PBMs of these requirements. And CMS now has the ability to impose sanctions and issue penalties and actually take disciplinary action against Part D plan sponsors and PBMs relative to some of these things. CMS is also interestingly going to get a big body of data regarding drug utilization, cost measures, dispensing by affiliate pharmacies, steering, and broker and consultant relationships that CMS will now get. And they'll be in a better position with that data to be able to protect pharmacies, to be able to investigate PBMs. And ultimately, the bill also calls on CMS, OIG, and MedPAC to together investigate PBM abuses and submit reports to Congress. So it's really taking almost a 180 when it comes to what CMS's role is expected to be in the pharmacy PBM relationship, going from basically a hands-off approach, we can't interfere, we're not going to interfere, to your responsibility is to make sure things are fair between the PBMs and the pharmacies, and here's the tools to get it done. PBMs have acted in a variety of different ways that have harmed a variety of different pharmacy providers, ranging from retail pharmacies, specialty pharmacies, even physician practices that dispense and bill Medicare Part D for outpatient drugs. Every kind of pharmacy provider has been harmed in some way by PBM conduct and PBM abuses. Probably the biggest way, and I think one of the core things that this law tries to tackle, is reimbursing pharmacies below their acquisition cost, below water reimbursement. That has been and sadly continues to be one of the core issues that pharmacy providers face, where they could end up losing money on dispensing very, very expensive drugs. I've heard pharmacies losing north of $500 per fill on certain expensive drugs, and the expectation is that they're still required to dispense these drugs to patients. That is one of the core abuses that this law seeks to remedy. There's also the notion of trying to limit the pharmacy provider's ability to challenge some of these unreasonable or violative terms and conditions. PBMs have long tried to put into their agreement provisions that limit a pharmacy's right to challenge their conduct, limit the method as to how these disputes can be brought. They've also included provisions, including strict confidentiality terms that really stifle and silence pharmacies from being able to report PBM abuses and what amount to essentially gag orders preventing pharmacies from speaking out against PBMs. And also, and I mentioned before, this concept of DIR fees. Well, DIR fees have kind of gone away as a construct. This was one of the things that had been a big driving force in this, is the notion that PBMs were using specious quality measures to be able to assess post-point of sale reductions in reimbursement against pharmacy providers for no other reason than lining their own pockets. And so one of the areas that this bill is aiming to focus on is what are those quality measures and what do they really drive? What are they really focused on? And do providers actually have a meaningful opportunity to affect whether or not they can score well on some of these quality measures? So those have been some of the core abuses that we've seen that I think have driven some of the core language that's now in this bill. The notion of delinking products, farm PBM reimbursement from list prices is essentially trying to remove that perverse financial incentive that aligned a PBM's profits and revenue with the list price of the drug. The higher the list price of the drug, the more the PBM made. And how does that work? That works in a couple ways. If a PBM is getting and keeping rebates, even a portion of rebates, and there is a spread between a list price and a net price. The bigger that spread is, and in turn, the bigger the list price of that drug is to create that spread, the more money the PBM makes. If a drug costs $1 and they get it down to 50 cents, and the PBM gets to keep 10% of that rebate, they're getting 10% of 50 cents. They're getting 5 cents. Now, imagine if that same drug, instead of being $1, was $1,000 and the rebate was exactly the same. You brought it down to 50 cents. That PBM is getting a much larger number, even if the percentage is the same or even smaller because of the increased cost of the drug. So there had been this big focus by PBMs on getting reimbursement based on the list price of a drug, whether it be from rebates, whether it be through other things like data fees, administrative fees, other types of fees that PBMs were bringing in based on the overall cost or price of the drug. Where this law seeks to change things is to now say PBMs can no longer derive any revenue, and not just PBMs and their affiliates, which would include rebate GPOs, rebate aggregators, upstream entities that PBMs have in the past couple of years used to try to get around rebate pass-through laws. Basically says PBMs can no longer, neither PBMs nor their affiliates can derive any revenue that's tied in any way to the cost or the price of the drug. Their only revenue that can come in this space is from bona fide service fees. Bona fide service fees essentially have to be fair market value fees for services actually provided and which are commercially reasonable. So this notion that PBMs are going to be deriving revenue from based on the list price of the drug is going to go away, and instead they're going to have to demonstrate their value and only be compensated based on the fair market value of those services actually rendered. Now, this requirement was driven more towards and aimed more at trying to break that spiral, that cycle where PBMs demand higher shares of the list price and forcing manufacturers to raise their list price. The hope here, I think, is that manufacturers will no longer have that pressure because PBMs will no longer have that financial incentive to drive up the overall price of the drug. And as a result, the PBM's revenue and business should be focused more on how efficiently they can deliver their administration of pharmacy benefits. I think where this helps pharmacy providers, though, is it shifts the dynamic from PBMs preferring drugs that give them the best financial model and financial outcome, and more towards drugs that just make sense. So rather than pursuing a drug that maybe a pharmacy is destined to lose money on, based on economics, just because the PBM is now getting a big rebate and maybe it's not the best for the patient. Now it's going to go to a drug that maybe is just the best for the patient and most appropriate for the pharmacy to be able to afford and dispense. So I think that's one of the ways that pharmacies could stand to benefit from some of this delinking language that's now in the new bill. There are a couple other things. So one of the things that the law also does is it addresses outside of the Medicare Part D space. It addresses some things in the commercial and self-funded plan space, and it builds on the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, where it now requires PBMs to disclose a host of additional information relative to commercial and group health plans, including all direct and indirect compensation paid to brokers and consultants and other service providers. It requires 100% pass-through of rebates, fees, and discounts related to drug utilization. It requires them to be passed through to the plan and creates additional audit rights that plan has. So it does extend a little bit beyond just Medicare. Although the delinking component wasn't there, there are other kind of protections that are there. The other thing that it seeks to do, which is really interesting, is it includes certain anti-retaliation and anti-coercion provisions within the bill that seek to protect pharmacies. And so now there's explicit protection for pharmacies that they can't be disciplined or they can't be harmed or retaliated against by raising a complaint or by issuing a complaint or challenging a PBM's terms and conditions as being not reasonable and relevant, which is really, really important because we've seen PBMs try to terminate pharmacies, or conduct audits of pharmacies, or take other kind of negative action against pharmacies that have sought to challenge the reasonableness of their terms and conditions. It also includes like I said, the anti-coercion provisions. This essentially prevents the PBMs from being judge and jury. They've tried in the past to force pharmacies to make a representation and to explicitly acknowledge and agree that terms and conditions are reasonable and relevant as a condition to come into the network, essentially even on a take it or leave it contract basis. So this would mean that even if they've presented you with a contract, and even though you stand to lose money on every single fill, and they will not negotiate with you. If you want into that network, you have to acknowledge and agree that those terms and conditions are reasonable and relevant. This law seeks to prohibit that type of conduct because that would essentially be coercion. They'd be coercing the pharmacy into making some kind of representation that isn't accurate and that isn't bound by those CMS set standards. So it's really interesting in the level of protection that's provided there as well. I think that there's two big concerns that, assume this bill gets passed, what are the things that happen? So one, I think, is a manpower staffing kind of agency action standpoint. So it is as I mentioned before, a complete U-turn of what CMS's authority and expectation is. There's going to be a kind of turning the ship around that takes some time, both kind of institutionally and metaphorically, but also just simply in terms of the manpower and the resources to be able to do that. So I do think that while the bill does have a delayed effective date, certain provisions don't come in until 2028, 2029. I still think that we could see some kind of delayed responses from CMS and being able to get off the ground. If you look at in the past, it has not been, an instantaneous turnaround anytime there's been this kind of seminal change in levels of responsibility. So I do think that there may be some delays or staffing issues when it comes to actually doing the new roles that are being expected of CMS in terms of setting standards, in terms of investigating and prosecuting complaints. And I do think that there's the possibility for a logjam even once this kind of gets up and running. The other thing that I see coming is, particularly around the delinking component, is you're taking away a huge and long-standing source of revenue for the PBMs. They have been, I hate to use the word addicted, but they've been addicted to this type of revenue and business model for years and years and years. They've evolved it. It has moved from being focused solely on rebates to being focused on data fees and administrative fees at a rebate aggregator level, through their offshore rebate GPOs. But they've been focused on tying their revenue to the list price of the drug. It is going to change how they have to do business. I think that there will be a focus in trying to do more of actual service providing and competing based on the bona fide service fees. But I see a future where the focus lies elsewhere. We have seen some of the PBMs already begin to build out their own manufacturers or co-branded manufacturing units. CVS, for example, has Cordavis, which seeks to co-brand different types of drug products. And if you look at the biosimilar space, the only biosimilar that has had any meaningful uptake has been CVS's biosimilar through Cordavis, where they've essentially mandated its coverage on formularies. And in that role, the PBM essentially becomes the not only the price setter from a reimbursement standpoint, but a price setter from an acquisition cost standpoint. And so I think that that is going to be a big area of focus by the PBMs, is examining where else in the supply chain they can try to replicate their historic business model. PBMs have become very, very good at the whack-a-mole game. And I think it's going to be important for policymakers, for pharmacies, for others to pay attention to where that's going to come out next.